All, all the tech is set up, so now we can actually begin. We're still in the first Mishnah of the 5th chapter. Okay, so it's taking us a few weeks to get this Perek started, but that's for good reason, because there's some very broad and important topics that we're discussing over here. So let's just recap. This Mishnah, the first Mishnah of the 5th Perek of Pirkei Avos, talks about the fact that the world was created with 10 mamoros. Okay, that's where we're starting. The fact that the world was created with 10 statements, with 10 what they like to call utterances. Okay, which effectively means that Hashem said, let there be X and Y 10 times. Now, if you go back and you check this up, because I'm sure people like to fact check and verify. So you go back and you look at the story of the creation of the world, and it does not say 10 times, Vayomer Elokim. It actually only says it 9 times. 9 times. Vayomer Elokim, and Hashem said, let X and Y happen. So now what? We've got a problem. The whole argument of this Mishnah is based on the fact that there are 10 statements of creation. You go back to Bereshis, and it only says Vayomer Elokim 9 times. So to address that, the Gemara says, Bereshis Nami Maimorhu. The first word, Bereshis Bara Elokim, is actually one of the statements. It's one of the statements of creation. Now that's interesting, because you don't hear the words Vayomer Elokim. You don't hear that Hashem spoke. So how can you call it a statement? Okay? So we'll leave that question for a moment. Then we'll have a look at the Mishnah again. We're going to revisit the actual words of the Mishnah. Ask perhaps one or two other questions, and then try and put it all together. So this is how the Mishnah goes. Ba'asara ma'amoros nivra ha'olam. The world was created with 10 statements, with 10 utterances. Then asks the Mishnah, Uma Talmud Loimar. Now, anybody know what that means? Uma Talmud Loimar. Okay, so now here's this. This is the trick. The trick of Gemara, or in this case Mishnah language, is when we use the expression Talmud Loimar, so you hear the word Talmud and you think, oh, we must be talking about the Gemara. Actually, Talmud Loimar is always an expression that means, therefore, the verse in the Torah says. Okay, that's the expression Talmud Loimar. So throughout the Mishnah and the Gemara, you'll often hear people ask a question, how do we know this? Or you might have thought that this would be the particular case. Talmud Loimar, therefore the Pasuk said specifically X and Y. Here it's a question. Uma Talmud Loimar. So initially, when we first looked at this Mishnah last week, it was just a simple question. Surely Hashem could have created the world in any which way that He wanted, and b'maimer echad, as we're about to see, He could have created the world with a single utterance. But now we're being a little bit more specific. Here the Mishnah's question is not only why did Hashem do it the way He did it, Uma Talmud Loimar, why did the Torah have to tell it to us? In other words, what is the Torah? What's the purpose of the Torah?
It's a blueprint for living.
It's a blueprint. It's an instruction. That's what it is. Torah is a book of instructions. How do we know that? Because the word Torah is from the word hoira or hoira'ah, which means instructions. The Torah is not, for example, a book of history. Yes, the Torah includes historical facts, but it's not a book of history. How do we know it's not a book of history? Because if it were a book of history, it really isn't a very good one. Right? So, for example, certain things are not in chronological order. Many things are in chronological order. But even those things that are in chronological order, let's take, for example, the hero of this week's parasha, which is Avraham, right? Isn't a pretty important person. I think we'll all acknowledge Avraham is a pretty important person. Yes? Yeah? Fair to say? It's a pretty important person. So can anybody tell me, what does the Torah tell us about Abraham's life for the first 75 years of his life? We get told he was born. We get told who his immediate family is, and we get told that his father left where they were living and moved elsewhere. That's pretty much what we get. Moshe Rabbeinu, would you acknowledge that Moshe Rabbeinu is a pretty important person? Yeah? Pretty important? In a certain sense, possibly even more important to us than Avraham Avinu, because Avraham Avinu introduced the introduction to Torah, whereas Moshe brought us the Torah. So for the first 80 years of Moshe's life, what do we know about him? We know that he was born.
Yes.
We know that he was put into a basket. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter. He went to the palace. And we know that at some point, we have no idea what age it was, at some point he wants to see what's going on the ground. He runs into some trouble, and they almost kill him. And then he disappears. And we're told nothing about Moshe's life from whatever age that was until the age of 80, other than the fact that he marries a woman called Zipporah. That's pretty much it. It's not a great history book, right? Here's another example. Between the creation of the world and the flood of Noach, what happened? What did people do all day? Who were the leaders? What were the civilizations called? Nothing. Okay, so we're clear that the Torah is not primarily a book of history. It includes history. It's not a book of history. What is it? A book of hoyra'ah, of lessons and instructions for us. Now, bearing that in mind, so we know it's not a book of history, what else should we say it's not a book of? So it's not a book of history. It's also not a book of... Well, here's what it's not a book of. The Torah starts with a letter base. And there are various reasons why it starts with the second letter of the alphabet. One of those reasons is to tell us that there's something that happens before all of that, which is not for public knowledge. The so-called Aleph. The existence that predates the existence of the world. So Torah is not a book of... It's not a book of those secrets. It's not a book of those secrets. The Torah is a book of what we're supposed to know as Jewish people in order to fulfill what Hashem wants from us, in order to be the best Jewish people we could be. That's the purpose of the Torah. Ma Talmud Loimar. This is the question of the Mishnah. So why does the Torah, or why does the fact that the Torah spells out these 10 utterances, why do I have to know that? Why is it relevant to me? How's it going to make me a better Jewish person to know what method Hashem used to create the world? Is that not part of the Aleph? Is that not part of what we call that b'mufla mimcha al tachkor, that you shouldn't examine those things that are beyond us? Is that not part of what we call nistar, the hidden parts of the Torah that are off limits for most of us? And even if we are at some stage permitted to learn those things, why would that be related to a hoyra'ah, a lesson in our lives? Ma Talmud Loimar. This is the Mishnah's question. Why did the Torah have to tell us the method of how Hashem created the world? Then, practically, v'haloi b'maimer echad yochel lihibaros. Surely Hashem could have created the world with a single utterance. He could have made a single statement, let there be multifaceted existence. And then that's it would have happened. Because obviously whatever Hashem has in mind is what's going to happen when he says the magic words. So it's irrelevant what words he says. It's his machshava, his intention, his plan that just comes into fruition. He doesn't have to spell it out in so many words. So b'maimer echad, with a single statement, it should have worked. It should have been created. So why 10 statements? And why does the Torah need me to know that there are 10 statements? Ela, says the Mishnah, it must be for the following reason. So we're going to rehash, because we did learn this last week, and look at the reason again and see if you could come up with the big burning question about this Mishnah. Lipora min harashoim, to take, how should we say lipora? Retribution? Is that a decent word? Okay, it's not an exact translation. Okay, so to exact retribution on the Rishonim, the wicked people, Shema'abdin es ha'olam, who destroy the world, Shenivra b'asar ma'amoros, that was created with 10 utterances, V'litein schar toiv l'tzadikim, and to give really good reward to the righteous individuals, Shemekaimin es ha'olam, Shenivra b'asar ma'amoros, who sustain the world that was created out of 10 utterances. So what is the reason that Hashem designed the world in this particular way? For what? For reward and punishment. That's what it sounds like. To be able to exact retribution and to be able to give rewards. Got it? So, any question that comes to mind? Questions that come to mind on this? Why? Yes? So let's try and understand what's going on over here. Let's try and understand. Hashem is Ein Sof, as we like to say, right? Hashem is infinite. Okay? So therefore, does Hashem have a particular need to fulfill if a being is infinite? Does that being have any needs to fulfill? No, because the definition of a need is that you lack. And the definition of lack is finite. So, is there anything that Hashem needs? Clearly not, right? Hashem doesn't need anything. So now what kind of an explanation is to say, why did Hashem create the world in a particular way to be able to reward and punish us? So what, does he need to reward us? Does he need to punish us? What, is Hashem kind of looking down from the heavens and saying, aha, got you, zap? Is that how it works? The Pora min harashoyim, right? He created the world in such a way that he's just got to focus and say, you're the one who's getting it today. It's just as deep as it goes in Judaism. The creation of the entire world is to be able to wrap the bad people over the knuckles. Is that the best we can, come on, is that the best we can come up with? So how is this an explanation? In other words, we're asking a question that really is mystical in nature. Why is it that the creation of the world is not made out of a single utterance, but out of 10 utterances? And why is it that the Torah has to tell me this? And then how do we answer it? By saying, because Hashem wants an opportunity to really get at those people who are bad. In other words, it's almost as if to say, the Bartanura says this. Can you imagine if somebody did, made a project, worked on a project, and it took them one day to complete the project, versus somebody who worked on a project and it took them multiple days to complete the project. And then somebody comes along and wrecks the project. So who's going to be more upset? Right? Who's going to be more upset? The person who spent more time, right? Because you invested more time, so therefore it means more, and it's more upsetting if somebody comes along and messes it up. So the Bartanura says that that's basically what it sounds like the Mishnah is telling us. Because Hashem, instead of just investing one step in creation, invested 10 steps in creation, so to speak, a greater investment. So therefore it's worse if somebody does something wrong. That's what it sounds like. So it almost sounds vindictive. The only reason that Hashem used 10 instead of one utterance to create the world is so that when somebody messes up, we can say, do you realize how bad it is what you messed up?
No, he wants us to fix it.
Okay.
He wants us to reach our full potential.
Good. So now let's ask how that fits, if it is about us reaching our potential. How does that fit with the words of what the Mishnah is saying? Lipora, that it's there to... Well, that's not what it means. That's not what the word lipora means. Lipora means, if you want the most direct translation, to exact payment. So again, let's say that somebody worked on something and then another person came along and broke it. They'd say, right, now you owe me because you broke my thing. You owe me, lipora, you got to pay. And the other question is, don't you think, as the creator of the world, don't you think the motivation for creation would have been something positive first, and then the contingency if things go wrong? In other words, don't you think the Mishnah should have said, why did Hashem decide to create the world through 10 steps or 10 utterances? Because litein schar toiv letzadikim. Because then if we do what Hashem wants, there'll be much more on offer for us. Surely that's the reason to create the world. Because as the Midrash tells us, the reason Hashem created the world in the first place is because teva hatoiv lehetiv. That the nature of one who is good is to share goodness. That's one of the classic explanations for the creation of the world. That Hashem is the ultimate good and therefore wants to share that goodness, therefore He made us. So, surely then the first statement should be Litein schar toiv letzadikim, to give us an opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on board. This is the world. Follow these instructions and then you can be rewarded. Surely that's the purpose. And then the contingency. Veli pora, and if people mess up, then there should be some kind of retribution or some kind of consequences. Why does the Mishnah jump first to li pora min oroshoim? First thing is, let's find a way to punish the bad guys, and only almost like an afterthought, and to give schar toiv to the tzaddikim. Okay, so it's a bit of a strange Mishnah, the way that it's worded. There's no perfect tzaddik. That's right. Okay, fine. But who says over here that we have to be a perfect tzaddik? Right? The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah is quite satisfied that a tzaddik could be somebody who just does more of the right thing than the wrong thing.
I think he wants and to follow in his way.
Right, now where do we see that in the words of the Mishnah? We all agree with those principles, right? We all agree that we're here in order to connect to Hashem and follow Hashem and etc., etc. But where do we see that expressed in this Mishnah? That's the trick, right? That's the difficulty over here. Okay, so let's go back a step. What would be the difference between a world that is created with one maimor, with one statement, versus a world that is created with 10 statements? Let's start there. And a clue to that will lie in the fact that the Gemara identifies the word Bereshis as one of the 10 statements. So right at the beginning, Bereshis bara Elokim, that in the beginning Hashem created the world, or as some like to translate it, in the beginning of Hashem's creation. So that's a statement. Now immediately, as soon as you look at that, you say, whoa, hang on a second. If you wouldn't have told me that that's one of the 10 statements, I would never have known that. I would never have known that it's one of the 10 statements. Now, why is that? Let's unpack this for a moment. And let's talk about the concept of statements, or let's make it a lot simpler. Let's talk about talking. Let's talk about speech. So what is speech? What does it do for us? Is speech an asset? Is speech a liability? Bit of both. Depends who, depends where, depends what. Right? So speech is an expression of what a person thinks or feels. Right? Speech could either express what a person thinks or could express what a person feels. Now, when a person wants to speak effectively, what do they need to happen in order to speak effectively? I'm going to use 2 examples, and we'll try and explore each example to illustrate the point. Example number 1 is somebody is going through a very intense emotion. So it could be the emotion of very overwhelming love. It could be the emotion of extreme fear. It could be the emotion of being totally surprised. So let's use that example because it's an easy example to use. Person opens the door. Standing there is a relative who you feel very close to, who you had absolutely no idea was planning to come to visit. You haven't seen them in X amount of years. You open the door, and what do next? Well, I'll tell you what you don't do. What you don't do is give a valedictorian speech. You don't start like some soliloquy straight out of Shakespeare. In other words, what happens when an emotion is very intense? We lose our words. Now the same thing will apply as it does with surprise, it will apply with fear as well. So if a person, God forbid, is in an extremely frightening situation, they won't have words. They might scream, or if it's even more intense, they won't even be able to make a sound. Likewise, when a person is in an experience of intense love, like the first time that a person becomes a parent and they see their baby for the first time, they don't know what to say. There aren't words. There aren't words that can do justice to the intensity of the feeling at that time. So that's the first. So we said that speech represents or expresses either what we're thinking or what we're feeling. So what has to happen to what we're feeling in order for it to translate into speech?
We need an emotion.
So we have the emotion. What do we need to happen to that emotion in order for, exactly, we need to process. And you know what happens as we process something? It becomes less intense. So the original raw emotion will dissipate through the process of our processing. So what does that tell you? That tells you that speaking indicates that a person has actually moved further away from themselves. The emotion is what I feel. The words are not what I feel, they express what I feel. Okay? So that's really valuable for us to know, that the process of speaking is that it always downgrades the intensity of the experience. When a person has reached the point that they can actually talk, that's when they've started to calm down. So they open the door and there's the relative there, and you scream and you burst into tears and you do whatever the case is. When do you actually say hello, welcome? Actually, only when you start to calm down a little bit. Now, intensity of emotion is very personal, it's very deep, it's very me. So therefore, by the time I get to the point I could speak about it, I've moved a little bit away from me. Started to touch the world around me again. Okay, that's one example. Now let's talk about thinking for a moment. So let's say that you have something to share. Something that you've thought of your own. You've spent a lot of time on this, you've researched it, or you've innovated the idea of your own accord. You've spent a lot of time working it out, and perhaps you're now the expert in your field on this particular thing, and we invite you to tell us about your idea, about your concept. So in order for you to tell us what's going on in your mind, which is absolutely brilliant, what do you need to do?
You need to actually use your intellect.
Yes?
And then you need to be able to take your intellect, and then you need to be able to verbalize that.
Correct. So there's the question. How does a person take their intellect, which is effectively how they understand the idea, and successfully verbalize it? Now, before we analyze this, let's just talk about an experience that we have all had. And that's the experience of a person who speaks to us, who knows exactly what they're talking about, and we have no clue what they're talking about. Right? We've all had that experience. And you know what happens, by the way? You know what happens when you get that kind of person who speaks, and especially if it's, if they were advertised as a very great speaker, so you all go along and you listen, and they speak right over your head. You walk out, and what do you say? They were brilliant. Because nobody wants to say, I don't understand a word. Right? So the problem is not verbalizing. That's not the problem. A person might very well verbalize exactly what's going on in their head, and that's the problem. So they need to simplify.
Break it down.
Okay? So they need to simplify. Now, in order to simplify for somebody else, there are a few steps, really important steps, but we're going to look at 3 steps that have to happen. The first step, probably the most important step, is to decide what you will not be saying. So, a person walks into a room and they're an expert on this topic that has 50 different angles to it and perspectives. They need to say, I'm not going to share 48 of them. So I'm going to whittle it down to 2 salient points that are relevant to the crowd. So that's number 1, is to filter. Filter out what I'm not going to say. Point number 2 is what I am going to say, I need to be willing to simplify, which means to get rid of the jargon that I'm familiar with that make me sound very intellectual, and instead use words that people can relate to. And simplify also means to use examples and illustrations and parables and stories and all that kind of thing, or maybe visual aids in order to help people that should be simpler for them. And then the third thing is to understand before beginning the presentation who the audience is. Because if you don't understand the audience, you may simplify and still completely miss the mark, because perhaps what you think is simple in their world isn't simple. Or you might oversimplify, or you might think that certain language will help them to understand it, but maybe there's a cultural difference, and so the language that you think is simplifying for them is irrelevant because we don't use those words. So you really have to know who you're talking to. In all 3 of those steps, you're doing exactly the same thing as processing the emotion. You're moving away from your personal experience. In your experience, you've got all 50 topics in your head, and you understand them all at the highest level, and you understand them obviously in your terms. So as you filter, simplify, and recognize the audience, you're actually moving away from yourself. So anytime that in Torah we use the expression speaking as a metaphor for Hashem, we need to recognize that this is what's happening. Number 1, if Hashem speaks in order to create the world, so then number 1, what happens is that means that Hashem filters out a whole lot of stuff that's not going to be shared with the world. So if Hashem creates the world through speaking, we can immediately recognize that 99.9% of what Hashem has to share, He hasn't shared in our world. Number two, whatever Hashem has filtered out, He has then simplified so that it won't be overwhelming for us or go over our heads or too intense for us to be able to actually survive. So we have a glimpse of what happens when Hashem doesn't simplify at the time of the giving of the Torah. There Hashem presents things as He sees them. And what happens to us? Well, our neshamas pop out of our bodies, and He's got to send a team of resurrection angels to put everybody back together again. And then thirdly, Hashem puts it in a way that is fitting to the audience. So not only is it simplified, but it is simplified for this audience called creation. In theory, Hashem could have made infinite audiences, and it could have been a different message for each of those audiences. But He's chosen to make this audience, and therefore to make it relevant to us. That's what we call 10 Ma'amoros. In other words, right at the beginning, when Hashem says Bereshis, we don't even know that that is a statement. We have to be told that that's a statement. In other words, the first step of the creative process is so vastly beyond us that we don't even know how to identify it, let alone relate to it.
Where does it say that that's the first statement?
So the Gemara tells us that Bereshis Nami Maimorhu, that Bereshis is the first of the 10 statements. We wouldn't have known it. That's exactly the point. It's not obvious. So, what would have happened if Hashem had created the world with a single statement? That would be like a person who's got a tremendous message to share with us, and instead of breaking it down and simplifying and presenting it to us in a way that we could understand, would walk into the room and say, now this is what everybody has to do. Why? Doesn't matter why. You know, Hashem could have created the world in such a way that we just exist without all these so-called intermediate steps, because the value of those intermediate steps is that it allows us the opportunity to find a way to connect. So again, let's say that a genius walks into the room and the genius says to us, this is how you now have to eat. Going for the route, they're a genius about human biology and about nutrition and about long-term health. So the person walks into the room and tells us, you should never again eat carbs in your life. Okay? So that's it. We all freak out, of course, because we have to have challah, so there's nothing to discuss. Not to mention, of course, homentashen and kaneidlach, etc. So, but the person walks in, it's not relatable. Unless you explain this, unless you make a point of access, we can't actually have a relationship. We could choose that we're just going to follow what that genius tells us, but it will always have the sense of lack, the sense of disconnect. Like, I don't see how I could relate to the whole experience. So Hashem builds into the system 10 graded levels of existence. That's what the 10 Ma'amoros are. It's 10 graded levels of existence so that we could actually, as we go through life, theoretically, grow ourselves spiritually and become closer to and more aware of Hashem. That's why, what's that?
I feel it would be any different if Hashem said, in the beginning I created the whole world.
Okay, so here's the thing. So good question. So let's put it this way. If Hashem says, in the beginning, there is existence. Okay? What would effectively happen is you'd have creator and creation, which is what we have today. Except the chasm between creator, who is infinite, and creation that is finite would be an unbridgeable gap. Because it's not possible for a finite entity to ever reach an infinite place. That's quite logical. So let's put it this way. Let's see. So let's put it this way. Let's say that you have two people having a race on an infinite destination, race to an infinite destination. One person has run 10 kilometers and one person has run 10 billion kilometers. Each one of them is still an infinite distance from the destination. Right? So if you're trying to go from finite to infinite, there is no way. But if infinite chooses to reach out to finite and say, here are a series of steps. The steps may appear as though they're finite because they have a number. There are 10 steps. So they may appear as if they're finite. But actually, they're the infinite reaching to you. It effectively means that Hashem has created a means by which we could connect. In other words, had Hashem only said creator and creation, there was no possibility of connection. Instead, Hashem said creator, creation, and a whole series of intermediate realities to facilitate your connection. Now, logically, should it make a difference? No. But if Hashem is reaching into our space and saying, let me come closer to you, I'm going to simplify. That's the first statement. Simplify again, the next statement. Simplify again, the next statement. That means that Hashem is creating a path to Him. We could never do that. The truth is we can't even understand it. See? AI definitely can't understand this, right? Now, in other words, Hashem has designed the world in such a way to allow us the possibility of being relevant, not just simply to be products. Okay, if we can put it that way. Now, we've got to ask ourselves a much more important question, because remember, it's Umma Talmud Loimar. Why does the Torah have to tell me this? Why do I have to know this information?
Because it teaches us how to relate to people and teach Hashem's word to other people.
So the truth is that in order to learn how to relate to people, it is true that we could look at this and we could see this as a template that we could use to relate to other people. Before we get there, though, we have to look at how it relates to ourselves. So what does the Mishnah say? Lipora min harashoim. The first thing we have to know is that Hashem has designed the world first and foremost with the Rashoim in mind. Now that's not what we would have expected, right? We would have expected that Hashem created the world first and foremost with the tzaddikim in mind. You know, the good people, that's who you want, right? What do you mean with the Rashoim in mind?
You have no free choice if you create it with Rashoim. And you're one of those that are created with Rasha, then no, we have free choice.
Well, if you create it as a Rasha, then that becomes a starting point, and then free choice goes from that moment and on. It's if a person is created as a tzaddik that we should ask the question, where's free choice? So
there's that Rasha in all of us.
Well, we don't have to look that far, unfortunately. We don't have to look for the Rasha in us. Unfortunately, you know, we can identify sometimes we are the Rasha, unfortunately. So here's the question. When Hashem created the world, did He create the world for perfection's sake? In other words, did He want the beings in our world to be perfect?
No.
Is that the objective?
No.
Okay. Now, why do we all say no?
He created both.
You know why we all say no? Because it makes us feel better. Because if He created the world for perfection, oy vey, right?
If He created it for perfection, there wouldn't be the opportunity to do anything wrong.
Well, we could always argue that the opportunity to do something wrong would be the challenge so that our perfection is worthwhile. Because if there's no challenge, then our perfection isn't really worthwhile. But it goes a layer, I mean, that's true. It's 100% true. We're going to take it a layer deeper than that.
How would you then earn if the purpose is perfection, what are you earning? What are you growing into to earn?
Well, if the purpose is perfection and we start off as imperfect, then we could say that we're earning that perfection through our efforts. Again, as opposed to being created as a tzaddik, because then what do you earn? But it's a layer deeper than that.
I think that Hashem has our potential up there in Shemayim, and He wants us really to try and be that.
I don't think anybody would dispute that Hashem sees our potential and wants us to achieve our potential. The question is, though, what was the purpose of Hashem's creation? Was the purpose perfection? Because as long as we speak about the fact that Hashem sees our potential and wants us to reach perfection, the perfection of our potential, then we're saying that the purpose is perfection.
The angels argued about.
Yes, the angels argued about humans. They didn't like the concept. Right?
So he said he could. Yeah.
Okay.
It
Okay.
will be perfect. So then it has to
So let's be clear. Let's be very clear. The objective of creation is not perfection.
It's goodness.
Why do I say that the objective is not perfection? Because angels are perfect. And if the objective would have been perfection, then Hashem would have created the angels and stopped at that point. The fact that he still went on to create humans, and yes, we're told that the angels debated that and said, why on earth should there be humans? And then again, at the time of the giving of the Torah, they debated that and they said, why is the Torah going to go to the humans? And in each case, Hashem showed that the angels were wrong. That tells you that perfection is not the objective. Because if perfection had been the objective, he wouldn't have created humans, or he wouldn't have given the Torah to humans. So what is the objective? Ma Talmud Loimar. What does the Torah want us to know? And therefore told us that there are 10 utterances that created the world.
He wants us to keep doing and moving toward that goal.
Toward the goal of?
Perfection.
So we keep falling into the same trap, right? We keep saying that the goal is perfection. So
the world will be perfected.
will it be? Will the world, so there's the question. When Mashiach comes, will the world be perfected? Is that the correct term? I'm not debating that when Mashiach comes, the world will reach its objective. We all agree with that. Is the objective perfection? So here's the chap.
The middle way.
So here's the chap. Lipora min harashoim. The purpose of creation of the world, Lipora min harashoim. Now we're going to translate the word a little differently, a little bit more directly. So far we translated Lipora min harashoim to be able to punish, essentially, to punish the wicked. But now we're going to go to a much more literal translation. Lipora, to collect payment, min harashoim, from the Rishoim. Now, what does it mean to collect payment? So there are various ways that you could collect payment. One of those ways is, and it's, listen, this is not a shir about investments and business, but one of the best ways to collect payment is to make an investment where you will get a greater return on your investment. Now let's talk about that for a second. We'll talk about it because what was the original name of the land of Israel, which is of course the destination of the whole Jewish people and the epicenter of our spirituality. What was the original name of the land of Israel? It was called Canaan. And what does Canaan actually mean? It means a merchant. Because it wants to indicate that the land, which is representative of the people of the land, is all about investment, about merchandise. Okay, so if a person had, for example, 100 grand to invest, and they put that money into an investment, and then 10 years later, they got 100 grand back, that would be perfect.
Lousy investment.
That doesn't matter, but it would be perfect. Perfect means you didn't lose anything. Nothing was damaged. That's what perfection means. Everything is whole exactly as it was. Exactly as it was intended to be. Investments are not intended for perfection. Investments are intended for growth. Investments are intended for capital expansion. Investments are intended to come out with something that was never there before. So, the world of angels is a world of perfection. If Michael is the angel of chesed, then Michael will do perfect chesed every single time. And how much growth will there be in the world of chesed? None. It will be exactly the same all the time. By the same token, although it's not identical, a tzaddik who does whatever Hashem wants all the time is also perfect. Does anything change in the world? Not really. Okay, a tzaddik can change in their own avodah, that's for sure. But does the world change thanks to the tzaddik? Not really. You know who makes the difference? The Rasha. Lipora, where does Hashem get his so-called payment? Min harashoim, from the Rashoim. Why? Because the Rashoim have the power to destroy the world. Shema'abdin es olam. They have the power to cause the opposite of perfection. And not only is that potential, that's where they go. They actually cause destruction in our world. That is the power invested in the Rasha, which, by the way, happens to include all of us, because all of us, at times in our lives, step into the world of the Rasha. We go into environments and do things that we're not supposed to do. But the goal is not to remain a Rasha. Then that same Rasha goes through a process which is actually the purpose of creation, called tshuva. If it was a one-statement creation, there would be no path back for teshuvah. There'd be two stark choices. Either you live in the Creator's world, the Tzaddik's world, or you live in the creation world, the Rasha world, and there's no way to take yourself back from the creation world, back to the Creator world. But because Hashem created the world, ba'asara ma'amoros, that means to say that Hashem created different scenarios, different realities, different access points. So therefore He created the invitation for teshuvah. That's the value of the world. Or as Shlomo HaMelech puts it, Vera'isi sheyesh, everybody translates this too generally. Vera'isi sheyesh yisron lachachma min asichlus. I have seen that there is an advantage to wisdom over, that's how everybody translates it, over foolishness. Keyisron ha'oir haba min hachoshech. Like the advantage of light. How does everybody translate it? Light, everybody says, from the darkness. Right? In other words, everybody knows that feeling when the lights come back on. Right? Wow, amazing, great, shkoyach, baruch Hashem. But that's not what Shlomo HaMelech says. It's yisroin ha'or, the advantage of light, haba, that comes min hachoshech, out of the darkness. If it's possible to take darkness and turn it into light, to take a Rasha and turn them into Baal Teshuvah, that is greater than perfection. That is revolution. That is transformation. The reason Hashem created the world and did not stop in the spiritual realms, which would have all been part of the single statement, because it would all be on the same page, it would all be in a singular reality. The reason Hashem didn't stop there, and instead He made a diverse reality with 10 statements, different possibilities, different paths, different challenges, is because that will give Lipora a greater return on investment than even perfection. So what happens when Mashiach comes? Taka. What happens when Mashiach comes? The world is not perfect. When Mashiach comes, the world is transformed. That means to say that even the parts of the world that by rights could never have been perfect are now part of the journey as well. Or to put it into very simple terms, if a person does something that they shouldn't have done, and then they do teshuvah for having done whatever it was, they don't become perfect for having done teshuvah. They become greater than perfect. That's why the Gemara tells us that the platform that a Baal Teshuvah reaches, even a perfect tzaddik can never reach. Because a perfect tzaddik gomor, lives in the world of perfection. But the real purpose of creation is to have opportunities to sink into the world of depravity and lift it into the world of holiness, which is greater than perfection. So that's got a really important take-home message for us, because what that means is that if chas v'shalom we do something which is against the Torah, we shouldn't fixate on the fact that we are now no longer perfect. We should rather focus on the fact that we now have an opportunity for teshuvah that will make us even greater than perfection could have been.
Wow.
And that's the message of this Mishnah.
Oh, wow.
How's that for a thought?
How they get that from